Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Lockdown Library with me, Asim Qureshi. So today, I want to think a little bit about the status quo of the times that we live in, about the purchases we make, the architecture of our buildings, the way that we even raise our children. You know, there's a constant kind of sense and feeling that we live outside of the harmony of the world as it's supposed to be. There's always this kind of feeling of disconnection. I don't know how it is for you, but at least for me, that I just never feel like the world as I see it is supposed to be the way that it should be, especially according to my own ethics as a Muslim in particular. And for those of you who have been following the work of Wa'il Halaq over the last, I don't know, decade or so, you'll see that, you know, he through a number of his books, you know, starting really with The Impossible State and then going into Restating Orientalism from a couple of years ago. And what he's trying to do is that he's trying to rethink, you know, the assumptions about the world that we live in. So that these Eurocentric ideas of modernity and the way that modernity has built this neoliberal system and world order that we live in. Like, what does this mean for us really? And are there alternative ways of thinking? And it's in that light that he has produced this book. It's called Reforming Modernity, the Ethics and the New Human in the Philosophy of Abdurrahman Taha. So this book isn't actually a book by Wa'il Halaq, you know, essentially. It's a translation and an introduction to the collected works of this Sufi philosopher from Morocco, Abdurrahman Taha, who's still alive today. And so what he's doing is he's trying to extract what the key messages and lessons are from Taha's works so that we can all benefit from them, so that we can all start to engage in Taha's messages and to see, well, what does this philosopher have to say about the world, which might help us to think about our own position in it. And I really found the book extremely fascinating. I think also because it really suited my sense of some of the discomforts that I have about the way that I live my life, and you know how I view my own, I guess, complicity in things that I find extremely problematic. So to begin with, and really what we're going to be talking about here more is not so much Wa'il Halaq himself, but we're going to be talking about Abdurrahman Taha and what he's saying. But of course, as always, we have to just bear in mind that Wa'il Halaq is the one who's translating this for us. And so, of course, this is whatever we're engaging with through this book is coming as a process of translation through him. So, you know, what he's effectively saying is that Taha, what he's saying is that for a start, you have to center that belief in God is absolutely primary if you want to bring about any change within the world and society. That this is a central pillar of his entire belief system, which, of course, as a Muslim, you know, I very much agree with. But what he's saying is that the problem is that in the world that we live in today, Europe is asking one question and Islam is asking a completely different question. And this ties back to this notion of belief in God, because the Europeans, you know, coming through the Enlightenment, they're asking the question, why should I be moral? Whereas Islam is asking a different question. It's asking the question, how should I be moral? And it's fascinating just what the recognition of these two different questions does for you, because you get a sense immediately of, okay, our starting position for how we're interacting with the world and with an afterlife are completely different to one another. We're occupying different spaces. So Taha understands this morality that he's talking about beyond simply ritual. Okay, and by ritual we mean like the acts of like ibadah that we do, the acts of worship that we do that are of course required of us, that are perhaps more superficial in the sense that they are the outward acts. But what about how this connects to the rest of our lives and the world that we live in? So Taha himself says religious practice does not stop at ritual, nor can it be confined to specific, limited, and restricted spiritual needs. Rather, the religious agent is a total man, because that practice extends to all spheres of his life, including the social, economic, and educational, not to mention the domains of diet, health, and much else. So we're given here an extremely holistic view of what it means to be um, a, a human, a Muslim who is thinking about their place in the world. It's everything. That's what he's saying. It's like every single aspect of life is covered by this schema that he's presenting. So because of that, Taha's central critique is leveled at secularism. That secularism, because as a project, it not only removes God's role from society, but it actually usurps, it replaces God's role with what? With the secular state as the master sovereign over all else. So you take out God from the equation, that's what they do, and you have to in his place put something else that has the ability to cover public morality. So before, God has that position covered very, very well, within the way that the society has traditionally structured itself. Well, with secularism, there is something new going on, where this new master sovereign is responsible for all aspects of public moral life. And he says that, of course, this brings about its own problems, right? Because when you start engaging in this way with this idea that you are the sole arbiter of what public morality is, that's when you get into problematic areas like with the banning of the hijab in France, which he calls a form of spiritual violence. So it's not like they're not then responsible for their own violence that comes from the state in terms of disciplining its population. They've just made up their own parameters now of what that looks like. But of course, they are the arbiters of that rather than potentially something that, somebody like myself would describe as being more universal or more eternal than what they're able to produce. But in terms of like what could come in opposition to that, he doesn't think that any of the Islamic movements that we've seen, within like kind of recent times really cover that. These Nahda movements, these revivalist movements, for him, they really serve to reinforce the Eurocentric ideas that already plague the world. So the notion that, well, you can take the nation state as it is with its kind of secularism and put an Islamic tint on it within all of the systems of violence we see, like such as neoliberalism, the free market, and so on and so forth, that somehow you can have an Islamic version of that. That doesn't wash with him, because he's saying what you do is that you just replicate all of those same problems, but just give them a Muslim name while you're doing it. So that doesn't work either. And what he says is, in their narratives, the Muslim tradition is as many things as liberalism is. It is, in fact, anything that liberalism wants it to be. It is amenable to capitalism as much as it is to puritanistic impulses of evangelism. It is also chronically contradictory, taking many irreconcilable forms and shapes. And, for good measure, it is also manifestly ambiguous. It is pantheistic in part and legal in another, philosophical here and scientific there, theological and literary, hateful and loving. So we can make of it today as we wish, a liberal reincarnation, and in line with this hegemonic liberal culture, which had secularized Christianity by expropriating its forms through secular humanism, Islam must be the religion of love and rationality, depending on the aspect of liberalism to which liberal Muslim finds herself inclined. So that's really fascinating for me because, as I mentioned already, what he's saying is that if you don't break away from this idea of liberalism at the center of the way that the world constructs itself, then whatever you do, you come right back around to it. You can't escape it. You end up in this endless logic of replicating the violence of the world as it is. And so for him, he wants to strip things back. He says what we need is turath, tradition. And that is the way that we can begin to rethink what our relationship is to the Quran, with the sources of Islamic law, with how we redevelop society. But turath as something that is termed as praxis. You've heard me use this term in this series before. Praxis being this idea that the knowledge that we gather for ourselves, it's not something that is just relegated to the space of interest. It's something that's lived. It's something that we realize through our actions. And so, what Taha is really promoting is the idea of um, the traditions of Islam as being something that can provide lived solutions rather than something that is abstract. And this for him is about ethics, that the ethics of the Quran, the ethics of the Sunnah really help to develop us in ways that are transcendental. They take us beyond like the simple base desires of this world. So, for example, if we want to think about the problems that are associated with sweatshops, with fast fashion, um, we can read this through the Quran because the ethics are all there. Um, but that requires a fundamental rethinking of our relationship to things themselves. You see, if we don't have that um, that awareness that we need to rethink our relationship with the world, then actually, even if we rethink about, okay, what do sweatshops mean, we're only ever going to come back to a kind of liberal understanding of that. But rather, if we think of it as a matter of ethics, well, what is my relationship to this thing, not only in terms of the world, but also in relation to the hereafter, then it could give us kind of unique ways of thinking about the problems that we see. So for him, the moral, it really governs the legal. He says the regulative technology in Islam is the ethical and the moral. Under this rubric, law becomes nothing more than a technical elaboration of ethics. So any law that you make, it has to be tied back to your ethics. It has to be tied back to the ethics of the Quran itself. You cannot engage in a process of building a society that is not at its center based around the elaboration of these ethics that cover a wide range and swathe of things. The problem that I found with Taha is that he wants it both ways. He wants to be inclusionary for all, while at the same time, of course, promoting this idea of an ethics that is rooted in belief in God and in Scripture. So this is the issue now, because what I think you'll find is that it's difficult to have both in a way that will please everyone. And that's I guess the hard part of this, that at some point he has to accept that he's not going to be able to carry everybody with him, that there will always be somebody that might feel somewhat disenfranchised with his project, which, of course, for a lot of philosophers is a problematic area to get into. And I don't actually have any answers to that myself. I just think it's an interesting quandary that he's in relation to how he perceives what change might look like. But for him, the change, it can't come from the centers of power themselves. He's very clear on this. It has to come from outside of those centers of power, and it has to come from what he says is a superior system. So you can't bring something inferior to the dominant structures and systems and replace that thing with it. It's not possible. You have to bring something that's superior, and that superior system has to be rooted in ethics that are more universal than the ones that are currently being implemented. So these are the three areas. Change has to come from outside of the structures of power, it has to be a superior system, and it has to be universal in the way that it is applied. For Taha, he says it very clearly that only religious authority can achieve this. And for him, that is through Islam itself. And so, I think what we get from the book, and of course the book is thick. It's there's a lot to it. I've just presented to you a very quick summary of how Halak has presented Abdurrahman Taha's ideas. But there is a lot of interesting ideas in there about, the way in which we have taken for granted the way the world organizes itself. And we have the ability to try and change that if we choose to do so. And I think that's central. If we choose to rethink our relationship with what the world might look like, and that, of course, it's ambitious, but of course, anything that's worth doing is going to be ambitious usually. So I want to end, because Halak's done the work. He's done a really great job of trying to present Baha's philosophy to us. So I want to end with his words that summarize Abdurrahman Taha's project. And he says, "We would be amiss to stop at the characterization of his project as a mystically anchored philosophy whose chief concerns are the spiritual and ethereal. An antidote to secularism, materialism, liberalism, and anthropocentrism, Taha's project is also profoundly political. And this is not in the usual sense of politics as institutional ways of managing society and polity, or the public debates that accompany such arrangements. Rather, his project is political in the sense that no sphere of human life can be segregated from another, and that if all spheres are merely varieties within a single unity, then there is no distinction between politics and everything else. And if politics is everywhere, and it no doubt is, then it must, in Taha's system, succumb to a higher order of things, to higher priorities that render politics subordinate. If these priorities are paradigmatically ethical, then politics too, as a system of macro management, tadbir, must be ethicized." That's such a brilliant summary, I think, of this work, because that's exactly the point, that everything has to be seen as interconnected through this idea of ethics. So even when you engage in politics, then without the ethics that sit at the center of that, the way that politics then take place, then you are effectively back to the same game, which is this kind of Machiavellian world of doing what you can to achieve power, to privilege some over others, and you will just replicate those cycles, even if you claim that is through an Islamic lens. And so I think as Muslims, in Ramadan, as we're thinking about our lives and our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think we need to be much more ambitious about what the ethics of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ can give us. And even if you don't agree with all of Abdurrahman Taha's works, I think what you can take away is the strength to conceive of a world that's different than what it is right now. So inshallah, I hope those of you who do pick up Wala Halak's book will think about writing to me and engaging me in a discussion about it. I very much look forward to hearing from you. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.